The ballroom of Hartley House gleamed with the light of 100 candles, yet Miss Adelaide Mercer felt as though she stood in shadow. Through the swirl of silks and satins, she could see her father, Lord Mercer, deep in conversation with the Duke of Northbridge. Even from this distance, the Duke's countenance was forbidding, his jaw set in a hard line, his eyes cold beneath heavy brows. At 42, Northbridge was a man whose very presence commanded silence, whose reputation for severity preceded him wherever he went. "He hasn't smiled since his wife died in childbirth," whispered Lady Pembroke behind her fan. 20 years of perfect misery. "They say he speaks 10 words a day at most." "And my father wishes me to marry him," Adelaide replied, her voice steady despite the trembling of her gloved hands. "To save us from ruin." It had been explained to her with brutal clarity 3 nights prior. Lord Mercer's investments had collapsed. Their London townhouse was mortgaged beyond redemption, their country estate would follow. Only a fortuitous marriage could save the family from complete disgrace. And Northbridge, widowed, wealthy, and in need of an heir, had indicated his willingness to consider the arrangement. "Better a duchess in a gilded cage than a governess in someone else's home," Lady Pembroke said, though her eyes held genuine sympathy. Adelaide watched as her father nodded deferentially to the Duke before making his way across the ballroom toward her. Lord Mercer's smile was strained, his eyes darting nervously to the other guests who pretended not to watch this drama unfold. "Adelaide, my dear," he said, too loudly, too brightly. "His Grace would like the honor of the next dance." "I haven't agreed to this arrangement," she whispered fiercely. "You will." Her father's pleasant expression didn't waver, but his voice hardened. "Unless you wish to see your mother and sisters living in poverty in some dismal flat in Cheapside. The Duke requires an answer by week's end." Before she could protest further, Adelaide found herself being led across the gleaming floor. The crowd parted, conversation hushed, and curious eyes followed her progress toward the tall, imposing figure of the Duke. His dark evening clothes were immaculate but austere, without the colorful waistcoats or elaborate neckties favored by younger gentlemen. As she approached, he offered a formal bow. "Miss Mercer." "Your Grace." She curtsied, fighting to keep her composure. The orchestra began a waltz, and with mechanical precision, the Duke of Northbridge placed one hand at her waist, took her hand with the other, and guided her into the dance. His touch was correct but impersonal, as though she were merely another obligation to be discharged. "I presume your father has discussed the matter with you," he said after several moments of silence. "He has mentioned your generous proposal." Adelaide chose her words carefully, aware of the watching eyes. "It is not generosity, Miss Mercer, but practicality. I require an heir. You require financial salvation." His voice was deep but emotionless, like cold water flowing over stone. "At 26, you are past the first blush of youth, but still of childbearing age. Your bloodline is acceptable, your reputation untarnished. It is a sensible arrangement." Adelaide felt her cheeks burn with indignation. "You make it sound like purchasing a broodmare, Your Grace." Something flickered in his gray eyes, perhaps surprised that she would speak so boldly, but his expression remained impassive. "Marriage among our class is rarely about romantic sentiment, Miss Mercer. I should think you would understand that by now." "And if I refuse?" His steps never faltered. "Then I shall find another suitable candidate, and your family will face the consequences of your father's financial imprudence." The music swelled around them as they turned. Adelaide was acutely aware of the whispers, the speculative glances. Already, she could imagine the gossip, the impoverished nobleman's daughter and the wealthy but dour Duke. A tale as old as aristocracy itself. "I should like time to consider," she said finally. "Until Saturday." He guided her through a turn with perfect, dispassionate skill. "I depart for Northbridge Hall then. If your answer is affirmative, preparations will begin immediately. The wedding would take place within the month." The music drew to a close, and the Duke escorted her back to her father with a correct bow that revealed nothing of their conversation. Adelaide watched him move away, his tall figure cutting through the crowd like a ship through calm waters, leaving barely a ripple in his wake. Later that night, in the quiet of her bedchamber, Adelaide pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and stared out at the London street below. The lamplighter moved from post to post, illuminating small circles of cobblestone that quickly faded back to darkness. "Like my future," she murmured. A soft knock preceded her mother's entrance. Lady Mercer's face was drawn with worry, the fine lines around her eyes more pronounced than they had been even a month before. "Has father sent you to convince me?" Adelaide asked without turning. "No." Lady Mercer settled onto the edge of the bed. "I came because I know what it is to marry without love." Adelaide turned, surprised. Her parents' marriage had always seemed one of comfortable companionship, if not passionate devotion. "Your father and I were matched by our families," her mother continued. "I was terrified. He seemed so much older, so worldly. I cried for 3 days before the wedding. And yet, we found our way to contentment. To respect. Even to love, of a kind." Lady Mercer sighed. "The Duke is not your father. He is, by all accounts, a difficult man. But he is not cruel. Not dissolute. Not violent. There are worse fates for a woman in our society." "What of love, mother? What of passion? Am I to live the rest of my days with a man who can barely bring himself to speak to me?" Lady Mercer's eyes softened with sympathy. "Oh, my dearest girl. You've read too many novels. Love is rare among our kind. But perhaps, with time." "He hasn't smiled in 20 years, Adelaide said flatly. "Not since his wife died." "Then perhaps what he needs is someone to remind him how." Lady Mercer rose and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Whatever you decide, we shall face it together." But as her mother slipped from the room, Adelaide knew the choice was already made. The weight of her family's welfare pressed upon her shoulders, heavier than any bridal veil could ever be. On Saturday, she would give the Duke of Northbridge his answer, the only answer she could give. The wedding took place on a grey October day at St. George's, Hanover Square. The cream of society filled the pews, not out of affection for either bride or groom, but because the marriage of England's most notorious recluse to the daughter of a financially embarrassed peer was simply too intriguing to miss. Adelaide wore white satin and Brussels lace, her mother's pearls at her throat. She moved through the ceremony as though in a dream, her voice steady as she made her vows to the stern-faced man beside her. The Duke of Northbridge performed his part with precision, sliding a heavy gold ring onto her finger with hands that neither trembled nor lingered. Not once during the service did he smile. The wedding breakfast at Northbridge House was a subdued affair. The Duke's London residence was magnificent but somber, its grand rooms filled with treasures collected over generations but lacking any sense of warmth or personal touch. Adelaide received congratulations with composed grace, all too aware of the pitying glances and whispered comments that followed her progress through the reception. "Poor girl," she overheard Lady Ashbury murmur. "To be shackled to such a man. One might as well marry a statue." Later, as their carriage began the journey to Northbridge Hall in Derbyshire, Adelaide sat across from her new husband, studying him in the muted light. The Duke stared out the window, his profile sharp against the gathering dusk. "It is a 4-hour journey," he said without looking at her. "You should rest if you wish." "I prefer to remain awake." Adelaide straightened her shoulders. "Perhaps you might tell me about Northbridge Hall. It will be my home now, after all." He glanced at her, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, crossing his features before his expression settled back into its customary reserve. The main house was built in 1692, though parts of the original medieval structure remain. There are 68 rooms, extensive gardens, and a lake. The estate comprises some 12,000 acres. "I meant," Adelaide said carefully, "what it means to you. What you love about it." The Duke's brow furrowed slightly, as though the question confused him. It is my ancestral home. My duty. Not a source of joy? Joy is a luxury I have not required for some time, Duchess. The title startled her. It would take time to think of herself as a duchess, this new identity thrust upon her by circumstance and necessity. Then perhaps it is time you reconsidered, Your Grace. Adelaide met his gaze directly. We have entered into this marriage for practical reasons, but that doesn't mean our lives together must be devoid of happiness. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile, certainly, but a slight easing of the rigid control he maintained. You are not what I expected, he said finally. Nor you, I imagine, what you thought you were getting, she replied. I may have agreed to this marriage out of necessity, but I will not live the rest of my days in silent misery. Nor, I think, should you. The Duke turned back to the window, but not before Adelaide caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his eyes. It was a small crack in his formidable armor, but it gave her hope. Perhaps there was more to the Duke of Northbridge than the world, and the man himself, believed. Northbridge Hall rose from the mist like something from a Gothic novel, imposing, magnificent, and utterly intimidating. Stone towers and mullioned windows spoke of centuries of power and privilege. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance, Adelaide felt a flutter of apprehension. This was to be her home, these unknown servants her responsibility, this taciturn man her husband until death parted them. The household staff lined up to greet their new mistress, faces curious but carefully neutral. The Duke introduced each one with formal correctness, though Adelaide noticed he knew every name, from the butler down to the lowest kitchen maid, an unexpected touch of consideration from a man reputed to be so coldly distant. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, led Adelaide to her chambers, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of blue and gold, elegant but as impersonal as a fine hotel. His Grace had the rooms refurbished for your arrival, Mrs. Winters explained, her tone suggesting this was an unprecedented act of consideration. The former Duchess's chambers have been closed these 20 years. 20 years, Adelaide echoed. A long time to mourn. Mrs. Winters's face softened slightly. His Grace loved her deeply. They were childhood friends before they wed. Her loss changed him. What was she like? Adelaide asked, removing her gloves and bonnet. Lady Catherine was gentle, soft-spoken. Music was her passion, she played the pianoforte beautifully. The Duke would sit for hours listening to her play. The housekeeper's voice grew distant with memory. After she died, he had the instrument removed from the music room. It's been in storage ever since. Adelaide absorbed this information thoughtfully. And their child? Born dead, poor mite. A son. Mrs. Winters shook her head. The Duke never spoke of it again. Threw himself into managing the estate, expanded it considerably. Rarely leaves except for obligatory appearances in Parliament. Until he went to London to find a wife. Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Winters looked at her with new interest. That did surprise us all. That evening, Adelaide dined with her husband in the cavernous formal dining room. Candlelight gleamed on silver and crystal, footmen moved with silent efficiency, and conversation was as sparse as the Duke's plate. He ate little, drank less, and spoke only to inquire if her chambers were satisfactory. They are beautiful, Adelaide replied. Though rather impersonal. You may, of course, make whatever changes you wish. Thank you. She took a sip of wine, gathering her courage. I should like to see the rest of the house tomorrow. Including the music room. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. There is no music room. Mrs. Winters mentioned it. And the pianoforte in storage. The Duke's jaw tightened. The housekeeper speaks too freely. Or perhaps not freely enough. Adelaide set down her glass. We are strangers bound by law and circumstance, Your Grace. I cannot replace what you have lost, nor would I try. But if we are to build any kind of life together, I need to understand the man I've married. For a long moment, he stared at her, his grey eyes unreadable. Then, abruptly, he set down his napkin. The music room is in the east wing. It has not been used in 20 years. You may see it if you wish, but I will not accompany you. He rose from his chair. If you'll excuse me, I have correspondence to attend to. Adelaide watched him go, his tall figure disappearing through the doorway without a backward glance. She sat alone in the vast dining room, the remains of their meal spread before her like the remnants of a battle neither had won. Over the following weeks, Adelaide settled into the rhythms of Northbridge Hall. She learned the household routines, memorized the names of the staff, and began to explore the vast estate that was now her domain. The Duke maintained his distance, breakfasting before she rose and often dining in his study, claiming estate business required his attention. Yet Adelaide was not deterred. Each day, she ventured further into the massive house, discovering rooms unused for decades, galleries of ancestral portraits, libraries filled with treasures. And always, she left something of herself behind, fresh flowers in a forgotten sitting room, a book of poetry open on a window seat, her shawl draped over a chair as though she had just stepped away. Slowly, Northbridge Hall began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home awakening from a long slumber. On the third week of her residence, Adelaide found the key to the music room tucked in a drawer of the housekeeper's desk. Mrs. Winters surrendered it with a mixture of trepidation and hope. No one set foot in there for 2 decades, Your Grace. It'll need a good airing out. The music room was located in a sunny corner of the east wing, its tall windows overlooking the rose garden. When Adelaide turned the key in the lock, the door creaked open to reveal a space frozen in time. Dust sheets draped the furniture like shrouds, and the air hung heavy with the scent of neglect and faded memories. With Mrs. Winters's help, Adelaide removed the coverings to reveal elegant furnishings, faded but still beautiful. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with scores and sheet music. A harp stood in one corner, its strings long since broken. But the pianoforte was indeed missing, leaving a conspicuous empty space at the center of the room. Where is it stored? Adelaide asked. In the old nursery, Your Grace. Up in the North Tower. Mrs. Winters wrung her hands. His Grace will not be pleased. Perhaps. But a house needs music, Mrs. Winters. And light. And laughter. Adelaide ran her fingers along the dusty shelf, leaving a clean trail. This room has been closed too long. Over the next several days, Adelaide supervised the restoration of the music room. Windows were thrown open, furnishings polished, fresh flowers arranged. And finally, under her direction, the pianoforte was carefully brought down from its exile and returned to its rightful place. It was a beautiful instrument of rosewood and ivory, its tones still resonant despite years of neglect. Adelaide sat at the bench, running her fingers over the keys. Unlike the late Duchess, she was not accomplished, but she could play simple melodies with passable skill. She was practicing a Mozart sonata, stumbling over the difficult passages, when a shadow fell across the keys. Adelaide's hands froze as she looked up to find her husband standing in the doorway, his face pale with shock. What have you done? His voice was barely a whisper. Adelaide rose from the bench, her heart pounding. I've reopened a room that should never have been closed. You had no right. The Duke's hands were clenched at his sides, his entire body rigid with anger. I had every right. I am the Duchess of Northbridge, mistress of this house. Adelaide lifted her chin. You cannot keep every room, every memory, sealed away like a tomb. It isn't healthy. It isn't living. You know nothing of it. He turned to leave, but Adelaide moved swiftly, placing herself between him and the door. Then tell me, she challenged. Tell me of Catherine. Tell me of your son. Tell me why you've locked away your heart for 20 years. Move aside. His voice was cold as iron. No. Adelaide held her ground. You may intimidate your servants, your tenants, even society at large with your brooding silence, but I am your wife. I will not be shut out. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. You are my wife by arrangement, not by choice. A transaction to secure an heir and save your family from ruin. Do not mistake it for more. The word stung, but Adelaide refused to flinch. And is that all you want from this marriage? An heir? A business arrangement? What else is there to want? He demanded. Companionship. Understanding. Perhaps even happiness. She gestured to the room around them. Catherine would not have wanted this, her memory preserved like a fly in amber, the music she loved silenced forever. Do not presume to speak of what she would have wanted. The Duke's voice shook with suppressed emotion. You did not know her. No, I didn't. But I know that love, true love, doesn't demand eternal misery as proof of devotion. Adelaide took a step toward him. She loved music. This room was filled with it. And now it can be again. For a long moment, he stared at her, conflict raging behind his eyes. Then, abruptly, he turned and strode from the room, leaving Adelaide alone with the echo of his footsteps. That night, Adelaide dined alone, the Duke having apparently retreated to his study. She retired early, emotionally exhausted from their confrontation, but sleep eluded her. Just before midnight, she rose, wrapped herself in a dressing gown, and made her way back to the music room. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, bathing the pianoforte in silver. Adelaide sat at the bench and began to play, not Mozart this time, but a simple lullaby her mother had taught her as a child. The sweet, melancholy notes drifted through the quiet house like ghosts. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice the Duke's presence until he spoke. That was the first song she learned to play. His voice came from the shadows by the door. Catherine. She taught it to me as well, though I was a poor student. Adelaide's fingers stilled on the keys. I didn't hear you come in. The Duke stepped into the moonlight. He had removed his jacket and cravat, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it. I heard the music. He moved further into the room, his eyes on the pianoforte. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. I'm sorry if I disturbed you. No. He shook his head. It was not unwelcome. He hesitated, then added, I overreacted earlier. The music room is yours to do with as you wish. Thank you. Adelaide watched him carefully. Would you like to sit? After a moment's hesitation, he lowered himself into a chair near the pianoforte, his posture still rigid, his face half hidden in shadow. Catherine was 17 when we married, he said suddenly. We had known each other since childhood. Our families' estates adjoined. It was expected that we would wed. Did you love her? Adelaide asked gently. From the time I was 12 years old. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, so briefly Adelaide thought she might have imagined it. She was everything bright and beautiful in my world. Kind. Gentle. Filled with music. What happened? She became with child after 3 years of marriage. We were overjoyed. But the pregnancy was difficult from the start. His voice grew distant. The labor lasted 2 days. By the end, she was too weak. The child, our son, was stillborn. She held him once, named him James, and then. He stopped, his jaw working. I'm so sorry, Adelaide whispered. The physicians said there was nothing to be done. But I was there. I should have. His hands gripped the arms of the chair. I closed this room because I couldn't bear to hear music without her. I put away the pianoforte because her absence from it was too painful to endure. And you've punished yourself ever since, Adelaide said softly. For surviving. For failing to save them. The Duke looked up sharply, as though she had struck him. How could you possibly understand? I don't. Not fully. But I understand grief. And guilt. Adelaide turned back to the pianoforte, her fingers ghosting over the keys without pressing them. My younger sister drowned when I was 16. I was supposed to be watching her. I looked away for just a moment. She swallowed hard. For years, I believed I didn't deserve happiness. In the silence that followed, Adelaide began to play again, the same lullaby, its simple melody filling the moonlit room. What changed? The Duke asked finally. Time. Forgiveness, my family's, and eventually my own. She looked up at him. The realization that Emily wouldn't have wanted me to stop living because she had. The Duke rose from his chair and moved to stand beside the pianoforte, his face grave in the silvery light. I don't know how to start again, he admitted quietly. After so long. Perhaps with this. Adelaide shifted on the bench, making room beside her. Catherine taught you, you said? For a long moment, he remained motionless. Then, slowly, he seated himself beside her, the bench barely accommodating them both. His shoulder brushed against hers, warm through the thin fabric of her dressing gown. I've forgotten everything she taught me, he said. Then we'll begin with the simplest part. Adelaide took his right hand and positioned his fingers over the keys. Just these notes. Like this. Under her guidance, he pressed the keys, producing the first halting notes of the lullaby. His hand was warm beneath hers, his touch tentative at first, then more confident as the melody began to take shape. They sat together in the moonlight, playing the simple song over and over until it flowed smoothly. And when Adelaide glanced up at her husband's face, she saw that his eyes were closed, his expression more peaceful than she had ever seen it. It wasn't a smile. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Winter descended upon Northbridge Hall, transforming the landscape into a realm of crystalline beauty. Inside, the great house gradually awoke from its long dormancy. Adelaide moved through its rooms like a gentle whirlwind, bringing light and warmth wherever she went. Fresh flowers appeared even in the depths of December, fires blazed in long cold hearths, and, increasingly, music filled the air. The Duke remained reserved, his habits of solitude not easily broken. But small changes appeared. He joined Adelaide for dinner more frequently, occasionally lingered afterward to discuss estate matters, and, once a week, visited the music room to listen as she played. Their physical relationship remained distant, limited to formal courtesies, a hand offered to help her from a carriage, a brief touch at her elbow to guide her into dinner. The Duke maintained separate bedchambers, visiting her only once, shortly after their wedding, a perfunctory consummation performed with correct politeness but no passion. Adelaide had not expected love, but the mechanical nature of the encounter had left her feeling hollow. Yet as winter deepened, something between them began to thaw. The Duke would sometimes pause in his conversation to actually look at her, as though seeing her for the first time. He began to ask her opinion on matters concerning the estate, listening with genuine interest to her suggestions. And occasionally, when she made a particularly astute observation, his expression would soften into something that, while not quite a smile, suggested he might remember how. On a snowy evening in late January, Adelaide sat in the library reading aloud from a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets while the Duke reviewed estate accounts at his desk. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the book-lined walls. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," she read. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." She glanced up to find the Duke watching her, his pen motionless in his hand. "You read beautifully," he said. "Thank you." Adelaide marked her place with a ribbon. "My father insisted we all learn to read aloud clearly," he said. A well-modulated voice was the sign of a properly educated young lady. "Your father." The Duke set down his pen. "I received a letter from him today. It seems his circumstances have improved considerably since our marriage." Adelaide felt a flush of embarrassment. "The settlement you provided was very generous." "Indeed." He studied her face. "You married me to save your family from ruin, yet you've never once asked for anything for yourself." No new gowns, no jewels, no entertainments. Those things don't interest me greatly, she replied. And our arrangement was clear. You required a wife to provide an heir, my family required financial salvation. The terms have been met. A shadow crossed his face. Not entirely. There is no heir as yet. Adelaide looked down at the closed book in her lap. No. Not yet. The Duke rose from his desk and moved to stand before the fire, his tall figure silhouetted against the flames. I have not been attentive in that regard. No, she agreed quietly. You have not. He turned to face her, his expression troubled. Is that why you came to Northbridge? Only for an heir and your family's security? Adelaide considered her answer carefully. At first, yes. I had little choice. But now. She met his gaze directly. Now I would like to build something more. A true marriage, perhaps even a family. Not just an arrangement. And if I cannot offer that? His voice was low, strained. If I cannot give you what a husband should? You speak as though your heart is permanently closed. Adelaide set aside her book and rose to stand before him. But I've seen it isn't so. You care deeply about this estate, about your tenants. You remember the names of every servant. You listen to me play, though it must bring painful memories. That is duty. Responsibility. Not. He hesitated. Not love? She took a step closer. Is it so impossible that you might feel again? That you might find room in your heart for something new? The Duke looked down at her, conflict clear in his eyes. For a breathless moment, Adelaide thought he might reach for her. Instead, he stepped back. I should retire, he said formally. It grows late. Of course. Adelaide masked her disappointment with a polite smile. Good night, Your Grace. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Adelaide, he said, using her given name for the first time since their wedding. Thank you for reading. It was pleasant. After he had gone, Adelaide returned to her chair by the fire, the forgotten book of sonnets in her lap. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. Inside, something delicate had begun to bloom, fragile as the first snowdrop of spring, but undeniably alive. February brought with it the Duke's birthday, a fact Adelaide discovered only through Mrs. Winters, as the day had gone unmarked for many years. Determined to acknowledge the occasion, Adelaide arranged for his favorite dishes to be prepared for dinner and had the table set with particular care. The Duke appeared surprised when he entered the dining room to find candles lit, a fine bottle of wine open, and Adelaide waiting in a gown of deep blue silk he had never seen before. What's this? He asked, looking around with confusion. A small celebration, Adelaide replied with a smile. Happy birthday, Your Grace. He blinked, momentarily taken aback. How did you know? Mrs. Winters mentioned it. I hope you don't mind. No, he shook his head slightly. I had forgotten the date myself. Then it's fortunate I remembered. Adelaide indicated his chair. Please, sit. Cook has prepared your favorites. Throughout dinner, the Duke seemed unsettled, as though uncertain how to respond to this simple acknowledgement of his birth. Adelaide kept the conversation light, telling him of her day's activities, asking about his, carefully avoiding any topic that might cause him to retreat behind his habitual reserve. As the meal concluded, she signaled to the footman, who brought in a small parcel wrapped in silver paper. A gift is unnecessary, the Duke protested. Nevertheless. Adelaide pushed the package toward him. Please. After a moment's hesitation, he unwrapped it carefully to reveal a handsome leather-bound volume. Beethoven's sonatas, he said, opening the cover to examine the contents. How did you know that night in the music room, you mentioned Catherine taught you to play? I thought perhaps. Adelaide hesitated. I thought you might like to try again. To learn properly this time. The Duke stared at the book, his fingertips tracing the notes on the page. For a terrible moment, Adelaide feared she had misjudged, had pressed too far. Then he looked up, and what she saw in his face took her breath away. Not quite a smile, no, that would be too much to hope for yet, but an expression of such naked vulnerability, such raw emotion, that it struck her like a physical blow. "Would you teach me?" he asked quietly. "I would be honored," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Though I'm not an accomplished player myself." "You play beautifully." He closed the book carefully. "I listen, sometimes, even when you don't know I'm there." The confession hung between them, intimate as a caress. Adelaide felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the sudden awareness of how much had changed between them in the months since their wedding. "Perhaps we could begin tomorrow," she suggested. "After breakfast?" "I would like that." The Duke rose from his chair and, in an unprecedented gesture, offered her his arm. "Shall we take tea in the drawing room?" As they moved through the grand hallway, Adelaide felt the warmth of his arm beneath her hand, the solid presence of him beside her. For the first time, they walked not as Duke and Duchess, not as strangers bound by contract, but as man and woman tentatively discovering each other. In the drawing room, a fire blazed cheerfully, and the lamps cast a golden glow over the elegant furnishings. Adelaide poured tea with practiced grace while the Duke stood by the mantelpiece, the new book of music still in his hands. "I have not celebrated my birthday since Catherine died," he said abruptly. It seemed pointless. Adelaide set down the teapot. "And now?" He turned to look at her, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "Now I find myself grateful to have seen another year. To be here, in this moment." The simple admission, so small yet so profound, filled Adelaide with a quiet joy. She crossed to stand before him, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. "James," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "I am glad you were born. I am glad you are here." Something shifted in his expression, a loosening, a surrendering. Slowly, he set the book aside and raised one hand to touch her cheek, his fingers whisper-light against her skin. "Adelaide," he breathed, her name a question and an answer both. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding. For a suspended moment, they stood on the precipice of something new, something terrifying in its potential. Then, with infinite care, the Duke of Northbridge bent his head and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, the kiss of a man who had forgotten how, or perhaps had never truly known. Adelaide remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile connection. Then, as he began to draw back, she raised her hand to his cheek, holding him close, deepening the kiss with a quiet sigh. When they finally parted, the Duke rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "Forgive me," he murmured. "I didn't intend." "There is nothing to forgive," Adelaide assured him, her fingers still against his cheek. "Nothing at all." He drew back slightly to look at her, his eyes searching her face as though memorizing every detail. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be a husband in truth, not just in name." "Neither do I," she said with a small smile. "How to be a wife. But perhaps we can learn together." His arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. "I would like that very much." That night, for the first time, the Duke came to Adelaide's chambers not out of duty but desire. Their coming together was slow, tender, a careful exploration rather than a mechanical fulfillment of obligation. And afterward, he held her close against his heart, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder as they spoke in hushed voices of small things, inconsequential things, the stuff of ordinary intimacy that neither had expected to find. As winter gave way to spring, Northbridge Hall continued its transformation. The Duke and Duchess were seen walking together in the gardens, riding side by side through the estate, and, most remarkably, playing duets in the music room, he still learning, she patiently guiding his hands over the keys. The household staff exchanged knowing glances when their master began taking breakfast with his wife instead of alone in his study, when he requested her favorite flowers be brought in from the hothouses, when he was heard to laugh, actually laugh, at something she said over dinner. "It's like watching ice melt," Mrs. Winters remarked to the butler. "Slow at first, then all at once." In April, as the first daffodils bloomed beneath the windows of Northbridge Hall, Adelaide received news that filled her with equal parts joy and trepidation: she was with child. The physician confirmed what she had suspected for weeks, and that evening, she waited nervously for her husband to return from his inspection of the tenant farms. When the Duke entered their sitting room, she rose to greet him, her hands clasped tightly before her. "James," she began, then faltered, suddenly afraid. What if this news reopened old wounds? What if it reminded him too painfully of all he had lost? "What is it?" he asked, crossing to take her hands in his. "You look pale." Adelaide took a deep breath. "I am with child," she said softly. "The physician believes the baby will come in November." The Duke went still, his face draining of color. For a terrible moment, Adelaide thought he might turn away, might retreat into the shell of grief that had encased him for so long. Instead, he sank slowly to his knees before her, pressing his face against the still flat plane of her stomach, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion. "James," she whispered, her fingers threading through his hair. He looked up at her, and Adelaide saw what she had worked for, hoped for, dreamed of for months: a smile. A real smile that transformed his austere features, that reached his eyes and filled them with light. "A child," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Our child." "Yes." She cupped his face in her hands, her own eyes filling with tears of relief and happiness. "Our child." He rose to his feet and gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of the most precious porcelain. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I didn't think it possible. I didn't think I would ever feel this way again. But I love you, Adelaide. With all my heart." "And I love you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Not because I had to, not because of our arrangement, but because of who you are. Because you let me in." The Duke drew back to look at her, his smile unwavering. "You made me remember how to live," he said simply. "How to feel. How to smile." And as he bent to kiss her, Adelaide knew that the grumpy Duke was gone forever, replaced by a man who had learned to love again, who had found, in an arranged marriage, the very happiness he had thought forever lost. Outside, spring bloomed across the grounds of Northbridge Hall, bringing new life to a world long dormant. Inside, in the circle of her husband's arms, Adelaide felt her own heart blossoming with the same renewal, the same rebirth. From duty had come devotion, from arrangement, affection, from necessity, a love neither had dared to imagine possible. And when their daughter was born that November, healthy, strong, and beautiful, they named her Catherine, not in sorrow but in celebration, a bridge between past and future, a testament to the healing power of love that comes, sometimes, from the most unexpected beginnings.